Hello. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate the CSS properties of background, color, and opacity. And we'll also talk about how to use transparency, which is a little different from opacity. So to begin with, I have a document that has no color or background styles on it at all. It has a style sheet attached, and it has two paragraphs that are identical to each other. So I'm going to apply some styles to this HTML document so that you can see how background and color work. So that you can see the elements that are in this document. There's an H1 that I'm not going to affect in any way. And there are two divs, and they are identical in every way. The text, they each have the same strong element inside them. And the only difference is that one has a class of special on the div itself, and the other one does not. But in the CSS file, there is not yet any rule for the class special, so that's not affecting that second paragraph in any way. And let me set up my windows so that it's easier to see what the CSS is doing as I change it. I'm going to use a palette that I made on the Adobe Color site. And if you've signed in with your Adobe ID, you can actually save different themes that you've made. So I'm going to be using this palette. It's not very unusual, but you'll see these colors in the examples I'm about to show. So I'm going to copy the hexadecimal code for the darkest blue in my palette. And I'm going to go into the CSS and to the body element, which contains everything on the page. I am going to set the color to that darker blue. All right, so I'll save. So I haven't reloaded yet, so you remember what the page looks like without that color applied to the body. Now I reload, and that color affects all the foreground elements on the page. Don't be too hung up on the idea of foreground. It really only means two things: the text and the borders. So if you look closely at my CSS for the div, in the CSS I have put a border element with no color properties of its own. It has a width property of 4 pixels, and it has a style property of solid, meaning it's a solid line, not dotted or dashed. So by applying color to the body, I have changed the text and the border color of everything on the entire page. So our next step is to see, well, what would happen if I wanted one of my two divs to be different from the other. To change one property on one particular element on a page and to keep all its other properties the same, in this case, to have the divs look identical in every way except for their color, it's a really good idea to add either a class or an ID to that particular div. Now in the HTML, I have already got a class of special on the second div. So all I need to do is style that class. So when you write a rule for a class, it begins with a dot. Then you use the name of the class, special, and you write it just like any other style rule, and it's going to be color, and I'm going to take it from my palette list, and I am going to take the rusty brown color, which is the second darkest color I've got. So I'm going to copy that, go in here, don't forget your hash mark. There's the hexadecimal code, don't forget your semicolon. So I save the CSS file, and I reload in the browser, and I have changed nothing about the second div except its color. And you'll notice that the border color and the text color were both changed by that application of a style to a class. So we've used the color property of CSS. Now I want to show you the background property. And I'm going to apply the background to the body, which means it's going to affect everything on the entire page. I'm going to grab the lightest color from my palette, which is kind of a cream color. And in my CSS, hash mark, hex code, semicolon, save, reload, and you'll see how that background has affected not only the background of the page overall, but the backgrounds of the two divs. So if you didn't want the divs to be filled in with the same background color, maybe you want these to look like standout boxes, you can apply a background to the div that's going to override the background color in the body. And if you want both of the divs to be the same, you're going to put it in the div rule, not in the special rule. So I will apply a background of white, which is easy to remember because it's the brightest, the highest, and it is FFF. You only need 3 if they're all the same. Semicolon, save, and reload. And you see how background can be applied to the entire page and to individual elements. Now, if we wanted the second div, which has the class special on it, to have a different background color, we could do that within the special rule. So I could say background, and I could get this very light blue color, hash mark, hex code, semicolon, save, reload. And now I've applied, and it doesn't look that great, but I have applied a background to that div that's different because of its class. I'm going to take that blue off because I don't like it. And the last thing we're going to see is how to apply both color and background to an inline style within the text. So if you notice in the HTML, let me pull this open for a moment, each of the paragraphs has the same sentence marked within strong tags. So there's a strong element in there. And you can see on the page itself, the strong element has made these two clauses bold. And we can also use the strong element, since it's already there, in our CSS. So it's an element, so no dot in front of it, strong. It's an element like body or div, but instead of being a block, it's inline. I'm going to make that a gray color, so 666 should work. And as a background, I want it to look like a yellow highlighter pen. So that would be FF0, semicolon, save, reload. And now you see that since it's I've styled all strong elements on the page, so it has nothing to do with a div that would affect any strong element, but since there are two, they've been affected the same way by having a gray color and a yellow background. So let's move on to opacity next. So I have a different set of examples for opacity, and first let's look at the HTML so you see how it's structured. There is an H1 at the top, and then there are 3 paragraphs which I'm going to use to demonstrate RGBA on the color property, the CSS property color. And the next set of paragraphs, 3 more paragraphs, I'm going to style those using the CSS opacity property. So they're done differently. Right now, the 2 sets look the same. The top set goes from 75% opacity down to 50, down to 25, and the second set, the same progression. The first line, example 1, is 75%, second is 50%, third is 25%. But they're done differently in the CSS. So you can see that the paragraphs are styled the same. This is 6 paragraphs. And the RGBA classes use RGBA instead of a hex code to make the color. And when you use the RGBA value, you put color values in parentheses, and the 4th one is the opacity level. So 100% would be fully opaque, and the 0 would be fully transparent. Opacity is a completely different property in CSS. For RGBA, you use the color property. For opacity, you use the opacity property. And now I'm going to show you how they differ. Because remember that color affects the foreground, which is the text and the border colors, nothing else. Opacity affects both color and background of the element. So if I've got a class of Op75 on a paragraph, which I do, okay, these classes are on the paragraph, everything about that paragraph is going to be affected. And the paragraph has both a background property and a color property. With RGBA, we can only affect color because, or background. We could put a separate background property on it and give it an RGBA value. But I'm going to show how they differ by taking this comment off of background 000, that means black, on the P element. So I have just enabled a new property on P, background of black. So every paragraph, all 6, these 3 and these 3, right? These are all in paragraphs. They're all going to be affected by that when I save. I've saved and I reload. So here you can see the difference. With one line, you can affect both the color and the background, one declaration. Whereas if you wanted to affect the background and the text using RGBA, you would have had to use color and on a separate line, background. So you would have needed 2 declarations instead of 1. And let's demo that really quickly on the last, oh, I forgot my semicolons. On my last RGBA example, RGBA 0, 0, 0, that makes it black. And if I put a 0.25, semicolon, save and reload, you'll see that now my third RGBA example is pretty much identical to my opacity example 3, but I needed 2 lines to do it with RGBA instead of 1 line for opacity. So that wraps up our quick tour of the CSS properties background and color with a little bit of opacity thrown in for good measure.